Thank you very much, Senator Alvarez. It's a great privilege to be here, and I couldn't let you down twice. And I made it a point to see that I show up over here, even though it's for a short while. And as it happens, I came in last night, and I'm leaving again tonight, back to New Delhi. But I'll be back here for the second week. And I'm very happy that you've organized this event. And I want to thank you and Dr. Victor Sebek for inviting me. I spoke this morning at the opening session of the COP, and I made a presentation based on the synthesis report of the IPCC, which we released on the 2nd of November. And I must say, this time in the 5th assessment report, we've been able to provide a substantial amount of information and details on what we are doing to the oceans of this planet. In a sense, therefore, and apart from being an engineer, since I was a failed engineer, I also became an economist. I think everyone talks about the green economy and what that's going to do for the benefit of all living species and human society. But we have not been concerned about what I might call the blue economy. Now, there are a few very important indicators of what we are doing to the oceans of this earth. Firstly, sea level rise, which since the beginning of the last century up to 2010 has been an average of 19 centimeters. And that's serious, because if you're living in a country which is barely a meter above sea level, and there are several small island states and other low-lying areas across the globe where that is the reality, then 19 centimeters increase, and this of course is not uniform across the globe. In some places it's high, in some places it's lower. The figure that I'm quoting is an average. It's something that really can cause major problems. And I'm reminded of the time when I was first elected as vice chair of the IPCC in 1997. Then I became chair of the IPCC in 2002. But in 1997, this particular plenary session where I was elected as vice chair was held in the Maldives Islands. And the then president of the Maldives, President Gayoom, addressed us on that occasion. And I recall what he said. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the place where you're holding this meeting 6 years ago was under 1.5 feet of water. And therefore, the important thing to remember is that it's not merely inundation of a particular area and complete submergence that we have to worry about. But the fact is that every time there's a storm surge, every time there's coastal flooding, if the sea level is higher, the extent of damage is going to be that much worse. And therefore, 19 centimeters is what we have observed on the basis of measurements in this century and 10 years. And if we don't do anything about this problem, then by the end of the century, we have estimated that without additional mitigation, sea level rise could go as high as 98 centimeters. So that's almost a meter. And that clearly is very bad news for several parts of the world. In a sense, that's going to change the geography of this planet. This is not the only thing that we need to be concerned about. If you look at the period 1971 to 2010, 90% of the heat that's been generated as a result of human-induced climate change has gone into the oceans. And they have therefore warmed up to a depth of 700 meters, and that heat is sinking down lower and lower. Now, what does this imply? This clearly means that the ecosystems under the ocean, that means all the marine ecosystems, are going to be affected seriously as a result of this warming. And also, all living species will be affected. In fact, now there's growing evidence that in several parts of the globe, fish stocks have migrated to other areas simply because with climate change they are not able to survive, they are not able to thrive under the conditions that have now arisen, and therefore they move away to other areas. And this has very major implications for a number of communities whose lives and livelihoods depend on the availability of adequate fish stock in areas that they are close to. The other aspect of what we've done with the oceans is the fact that they are acidifying very rapidly. And here may I mention that since the beginning of industrialization, of all the carbon dioxide that's been emitted, 30% has gone into the oceans. And that has led to considerable acidification. Now the pity of it is there is very inadequate research on the impacts of, let's say, warming of the oceans, impacts of acidification of the oceans, and therefore there is clearly a research agenda that communities across the globe have to pursue. And research and academic institutions really have a responsibility to the sustainability of this planet by carrying out research on what's going to happen with growing acidification and growing warming of the oceans. And as I mentioned, so far the warming has been largely up to a depth of 700 meters, and it's now sinking lower and lower. And as it gets lower, then clearly there'll be a much larger set of marine species and ecosystems that are going to be affected than is the case up to a depth of 700 meters. So all of this clearly means that while we have been focused largely on what happens on land, it's crucially important that oceans, which cover the largest area on the globe, need to be looked at in terms of excuse me, the implications of climate change. And what is it that we can do? While species on land can to some extent adapt to the impacts of climate change, you really can't do that with the oceans. And therefore the security of living organisms, of ecosystems that are in a marine environment is really totally in a state of helplessness. I also want to mention that even on land, beyond a certain point, adaptation will not work, because we would have created impacts, we would have created extreme events which are on the increase both in intensity and frequency, as a result of which adaptation beyond a certain point will not work. So what is crucially important is for the globe and for human society to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. What we have said in the fifth assessment report is that if we want to stabilize temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, then it's absolutely essential that by the middle of the century we treble or quadruple low or zero carbon sources of energy supply, because 35% of the emissions of greenhouse gases come from the energy sector. So we need to bring about a major transition as far as energy supply is concerned. And this would also mean that deforestation has to be cut down. Thank you. And we have to ensure that we have to expand forest area, and possibly we need an urgent effort to bring about commercialization and feasibility of carbon capture and storage. So there's a whole range of initiatives that are required to be taken immediately, because if we delay action, then the cost of mitigation to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius will go beyond our expectations. And some of the technologies that would be required to bring about a very sharp reduction in emissions will really not be feasible. So may I submit that we need two important sets of actions. Firstly, much greater research on what is happening to marine ecosystems, marine species, as a result of the impacts of climate change. And secondly, we need to bring about very rapid reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, if 2 degrees Celsius is going to be our target by the end of the century, or less than that, then we have also estimated that by the end of the century, emissions of greenhouse gases will either have to be zero or actually in the negative range. This is what we really need to move towards. Because even with the 2-degree increase in temperature, the scenario that we have assessed for bringing that about as a stabilization target will still lead to sea level rise of between 0.26 to 0.55 meters. So let's say even if you end up in the middle of this range, let's say 0.40 meters, that's a lot. And that certainly threatens several parts of the globe, and it has serious implications for human society, other living species, and ecosystems, particularly in coastal areas in the small island states. So I'm very happy that this event has been organized, because the time has come when we have to focus on ocean security, when we have to look at human actions by which we can ensure security of the oceans. Because if we don't, then we're clearly creating conditions by which coming generations are going to hold us responsible for something that's going to be irreversible, that will not lend itself to any correction, and certainly this is not the kind of outcome we want from our actions for coming generations, and of course generations that exist today in the vicinity of the oceans and that are going to be vulnerable to the effects of sea level rise, the effects of acidification, the effects of warming of the ocean. And this is all I wanted to say, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here. Thank you very much.